Hi kids, it's me again, Mr. Wade, and I am excited to talk to you again today. Last week we talked about what God created on the second day, when He created the waters and He created the sky and He separated them apart. Well, today God continues His creative process, and today He actually brings forth the land out of the waters so that we see that islands and places where we can live and places where we can walk, they actually come out of the ocean and we have dry land. But not only that, we have something else that happens now on the third day. God creates for the very first time life in our universe. He brings life in the form of vegetables and fruits and all of these great things that you see sitting right here. God brings them forth on the third day. And so let's go today and learn a little bit more about how God brings forth all of the yummy stuff we get to eat. All right, well, we are here starting our lesson about what God created when He called forth the earth out of the sea. We're here in the kitchen because God is still calling forth earth out of the ocean even today. He's doing it through these things we call volcanoes. And when you think about volcanoes, a lot of times you think about the vinegar and baking soda, and we'll do that in a little bit just to show you what we mean. But there's some other things that we want to do to show you how God called forth everything out of the sea. We still see God calling these volcanoes to blow up islands out of the ocean. In fact, in December 2014, just 6 years ago, a whole new island formed in the Pacific Ocean because God Himself sent a volcano to erupt and bring up all of this great land. God did that so long ago, not because He needed a volcano to do it, but simply because He said it and it happened. Today, we're going to watch something that looks a little bit like what God would do when He was using those volcanoes. So let's take a look at this. We're going to take this piece of wax and we're going to put it in the beaker. Remember, these beakers are special types of glass that don't break when we put them on a hot place. And that's what we're going to do in a minute because, well, volcanoes, they're hot. Now we're going to take this sand, something that God would call forth when He was bringing it out of the ocean. And we're going to cover this with a lot of sand and just get it good and covered. Now, let's fill up this jar with a little bit more water. Make sure it's good and covered here. Now let's watch what happens when we take this jar and we put it on the heat. It's going to take a little while, but watch closely what's going to happen. So you could see how the wax just bubbles up out of all of this sand, and as it comes up through the water, you can see how it forms on top and just sits there. This is exactly what God was doing when He was calling things forth, as He was bringing this land out of the ocean and bringing it to the top and setting it there. And this is what He is still doing today with the volcanoes that we have in the ocean. Islands are forming today because God, by the power of His word, is bringing things forth. Now, we just did this with some wax because we can't bring islands forth. We're not God. We had to do a whole bunch of things, but God, just by saying it, brought everything on the third day forth so that you and I can walk around, that we could sit on this ground, and that we can enjoy the earth out there. I promised you we'd do a vinegar and baking soda volcano. Let's see what it's going to look like. We saw those volcanoes blow out wax and then blow out vinegar and baking soda, and we saw what they look like. And when those volcanoes erupt, when God caused them to erupt, real volcanoes don't blow out wax. Real volcanoes don't blow out baking soda and vinegar. They blow out rocks, like this piece of obsidian here. Rocks that are formed in the very middle of the earth. Things that God has formed with His own two hands. He has made and He has shot them out into the earth. And so we can go around and find rocks like these that are blown out. We can go around and find other rocks that are smashed together and they are crushed together like this piece of thin slate that God has made and covered our earth in. Or, because we're in Nebraska, you can go around and you can find these pieces of limestone. Things that God has taken and layered. All of these different dead things that lived in oceans at one time, they layer together and together and together and together, and they make these rocks called limestone that you can go out and find right now. And if you're like me, you can go out and you can find the fossils still in them because, let's be honest, the fossils are the coolest part of looking at a rock. But God made each of these rocks. He made them and He brought them forth. Now, God didn't just make rocks come from volcanoes because he wanted a sandbox. He didn't just create dry land because, well, he loves sand. He didn't just create land because he wanted to see a mud hole full of dirt. No. God created the earth because he was intending to bring life onto that earth. But remember, up until now, God has not put life on this earth yet. That's important because as we think about the rock that this earth is created on, we are reminded so much throughout the Bible that God, Jesus himself, is our rock. God has created rocks not just for us to stare for fossils at, not just because they're cool because they got blown out of a volcano. God created rocks like this to remind us that he is our rock. He is our firm foundation, and on him we can trust in him. But now that God has created rocks, this is when we see God get really creative. He starts to create all the trees, the vegetables, and everything else that we see alive. Well, kids, God wasn't just making dirt. He wasn't just making a sand pile. God was making a garden. And he was making a beautiful garden on this earth full of trees and plants and all sorts of stuff. Now, when we think of beautiful places, I like to think of Brazil. One time when I went to Brazil, it was such a cool place because we walked down the middle of this river. And when we got to the end of it, there's trees and rainforest on all the sides, but there's a huge cave, a big, big cave at the end. And coming from the top of the cave, there's a hole that has a waterfall falling down the middle and all the sunlight coming through. And so you're standing in this cave in the middle of the rainforest and there's water falling with light coming through and going in all different directions. It was one of the most beautiful places that I've seen. Now I've got here my friend, Mr. Ted. And Mr. Ted, what are some beautiful places that you've been?
Easily one of the most beautiful places I've been to, Wade, is Colorado.
Oh.
So a few years ago, my family and I went to Colorado, and I can think of one night in particular. It was the evening, the sun was setting, and we went up into the mountains to see a lake.
Oh, yeah.
And we hiked around the lake, and we were surrounded by the big peaks and big pine trees.
Yes.
Walking around this beautiful lake, and that was just a gorgeous scene for us.
Yes, you've got to love the mountains, right? Because the mountains are exciting because they are such big because God has called them forth, right? But then if you notice, Mr. Ted talked about the pine trees that are all around. And I talked about the rainforests that are all around. See, these places are beautiful not just because there are mountains, not just because there is a river, but they're beautiful because God has put plants there. And those plants are so cool. And you can see a lot of the things that we have here today. We've got cucumbers and peaches and oranges. We've got tomatoes and bananas. These things that God has made that all look so different. They taste so different. They seem so different. But you know what's all of these things have in common? Every one of them has something called DNA. I like to call it deoxyribonucleic acid. It's DNA. But this DNA is so cool because all of these have this DNA in common, and the same DNA that is used for each of these, that God has put into each of these, grow them into a cucumber, a tomato, a red tomato, even yellow tomatoes. DNA is used to create all these different things, and every living thing in the world has DNA in it. And so, I am excited about this next experiment. We're going to go take a look at DNA of strawberries. So let's grab the strawberries. Ted, you ate the strawberries.
They're delicious, Wade.
We're going to improvise here, and we are going to use, then, bananas. Let's go find the DNA for a banana. So DNA is super interesting. It's got two bones. Well, they're not actually bones, but we call them backbones. They're made out of special sugars. But then inside, it's got little chemicals. It's got C's, it's got T's, it's got A's, and it's got G's. And they have fancy names, but we just call them C's, A's, T's, and G's. And every time you see a C, it is right next to a T like that. Every time you see a T, it's right next to what? You guessed it, a C. And every time you say an A, it's next to a G, and G's are next to A's. And so we see these go like this, and it's like a chain. And these DNA chains form all of the life around us. So we're going to actually take a look at DNA here. Now, we were going to use a strawberry, but as you saw, Mr. Ted got a little hungry. So we're going to have to solve our DNA problem with a banana. So this is something you could do at home. The stuff that you see here is stuff that you all have at your house, I'm sure, right now. So let's take a look at how we can get DNA out of this banana. So we're going to start by taking our banana, half of it, and peeling it. Make sure it's a good ripe banana. We want it to be soft. We don't want it to be a hard green banana. Stick it in a Ziploc bag, and then here's the fun part. Just mash it up. Really, 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 really good. You want to try to mash it up until there are no big pieces left. Just as small as you can get. You want it almost to be like pudding. Banana pudding. And so we're just going to mash it up for a little bit. Now that we've got our banana pudding, the next step is to take a cup of hot water. Now this coffee cup has really hot water in it, so we only have it about half full. But we are going to put 1 teaspoon of salt in it. Now I've got a half teaspoon here, so I'm going to put 2 of them in. So I've got my first one, and I've got my second one. And we want to make sure and mix it real good. Now what the salt's going to do is it's going to help all the DNA that's in this banana to come together and stick together so that we can actually see it. Because remember, DNA, it's super, super small. And so we want to put it in something that we can see. Once you have your DNA inside of that, or once you have your salt inside of your cup, pour all that hot water straight inside and seal it back up. Now what you want to do is you want to try to mix it around again. And just sit there and mix and let it all get kind of good and mixed up. And do that for about a minute. All right, now that we have our salty banana sludge, we're going to do our next step. Now this one you need to be a little more careful for, because we're going to put some dishwashing soap, things that you might wash the dishes with. We're going to put a half teaspoon of that inside here. But the trick is, we want to try to make as little bubbles as possible. You can see we already have bubbles in it, and that's okay because this is just salt bubbles. We want to try to make the fewest bubbles possible with our soap. So we're going to open this really, really carefully so we don't spill our banana sludge. And we're going to put half a teaspoon of dish soap in. We want to make sure we get all of it in there, so I'm going to mix it around just a little bit. But remember, we're trying not to make any bubbles. Seal it back up, but this time, let's try to get all the air out of there. So there's no air inside our bag. Now we want to lay it flat, because we don't want to shake it, because we'll make a bunch of bubbles. Once it's flat, just kind of move it around with your fingers. We're just trying to get all the soap mixed in there really, really good. Now what the soap is doing is, see, all of the cells that are inside that banana, they all have something called a cell membrane. And that cell membrane holds all of the DNA and everything else inside the cell together. When we put the soap in here, what the soap is doing is it's actually breaking up that cell membrane so that nothing inside can live. And so when it pops those cells and causes them to just burst, all that DNA comes out. So right now what we're doing is we're trying to get all those cells that are inside here to pop so our DNA can come out. And that salt that's in that water, that salt's going to make the DNA start to stick together. All right, once you have it good and mixed, you're going to want to let it sit for about 5 to 10 minutes, somewhere in there, and just let it sit there. All right, well, we have spent about 10 minutes waiting for this to mix up. And all of those cell walls are broken down now so that all of the DNA should be out in here, and the salt's making it join together so that we can actually see it. But it is stuck in a bag, so we have to get this out. This is where a coffee filter comes in. Coffee filters are good not just for filtering coffee, but for filtering just about everything. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set the coffee filter into our cup, and then we are going to get this concoction out and slowly pour it through. All right, the rest of it we could throw away now because that's just the banana and all that part of that. But you can see now that we've got this really weird colored, almost pink sludge in here, and there's no pieces of banana floating around. Our DNA is all inside of that cup right now. You can't see it very well because it's all dissolved inside this water. So we have some super, super, super cold rubbing alcohol that's been in the freezer for 3 days. It's got to be really cold. And what we're going to do is we're going to slowly pour this rubbing alcohol on top of here so that we have a layer of rubbing alcohol on top of all of the banana juice that we separated out. And then once we do that, we'll see if we can get a look at that DNA. So we're going to pour this in really, really slow so it tries not to mix. All right. We now have a layer of rubbing alcohol on top. And so we're going to take a toothpick and we're going to try to see if we can grab some of this DNA out. I can see the DNA already. I'm not sure if you could see it from there, but it is very obvious to me. So let's see if we can pull any of it out. Do you see that there on the end of the string? That is DNA. The same stuff that God has put in every single living thing across this entire great big earth, that's what you're looking at right here. This DNA makes a banana. The DNA that's inside a strawberry like Mr. Ted ate, that makes a strawberry. The DNA that's inside of you makes you. But it's always the same. A's, C's, T's, and G's. They are in every piece of DNA. They're in here right now. They're inside you, they're inside bananas, and they're even inside the strawberries. You could do this at home. You saw how we did this, and you can use anything. Strawberries, kiwis, bananas. You can even take some cells out of your own mouth by putting that salt water that we mixed up, put it in your mouth and swish it around for a minute, and then spit it into a cup, and you could do it with your own cells in your mouth. You too could see what God has done and look at the DNA that is so super small inside our cells, but something that we can physically see here. I was so excited to get to share that DNA experiment with you because I think it's so fascinating to see that all of this stuff that we have here, bananas and tomatoes and radishes, all of these things have DNA in them. They've got the same pieces and chemicals that we saw, that we pulled out that small strand. God has put that in every living thing, and so every living thing has DNA. But the fun thing is, just because they have DNA doesn't mean they have the same DNA. See, Jesus reminded us in Matthew 7 that there are not going to be good fruit come from a thistle. There's not going to be good fruit that comes from thorn bushes because the thorn bushes have thorn bush DNA. The good fruit has good fruit DNA. And that's a good thing for us to remind us that we want to have good DNA that Jesus, our great brother, brings to us because Jesus is changing us inside and he's making us more like himself. And that's exciting because as we become more like Jesus, we exude the fruit of the Spirit like it says in Galatians. We get to exude things like kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. We get to show these things off because that is what Jesus is like, and as we are changing more like him, we get to become more like him, and we get to show those traits. So I want to share something else with you about genetics that's super exciting and about DNA that's super exciting. You know what this is? It's a pea, a snap pea. I don't know about you guys, but our family loves snap peas a lot. Back in the 1800s, there was a guy who was named Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel also loved snap peas, and so he started to watch snap peas so much. Now, what you need to know about Gregor Mendel is he also loved God so much. He followed God his whole life and listened to God and was trying to figure out what God was doing in the world around him. And so when Gregor Mendel said that he loved peas, it wasn't just because he liked to eat them. He loved them because he liked to watch them and learn about them. He looked at them to see how tall they would grow. He looked at them to see what color they would be. He looked at them to see which ones would be bigger, which ones would be smaller. And he started to figure things out about what God was doing in his creation. This is only about 200 years ago when Gregor Mendel figured this out. Let's see what he figured out because it has a bearing on all of our lives today. So Mr. Mendel, he ends up doing something like this. He says, well, let's make a chart. And let's make this chart in 4 boxes. And remember how I told you he loved to learn if the peas grew really, really big or really, really small. So he realized that the pea plant would have 2 what we call genes, 2 different pieces of DNA. And some of those pieces would be big, tall plants. So there would be 2 genes, 2 pieces of DNA for tall pea plants. Some of them would be 2 short pea plants. Some of them would be a tall and a short pea plant. And they would have these mixes of genes. Now, Gregor Mendel realized that when he looked at these things, if they were tall and had 2 tall genes, that would make a tall pea plant. But if it was 2 short pea plants, it would become a short pea plant. Well, this one was confusing. What about when it's tall and short? Mendel studied it and looked at these peas over and over, and what he realized was when it had a tall pea, it always made a tall P. When there was a tall gene here, it always made the tall P. And so Gregor Mendel went further and he said, hey, this makes a lot of sense. So if I have a tall P up here and a tall P up here, and then a little p down here and a little p down here in my chart, well, what happens when one of the parents of a pea plant has two talls and one of the parents has two shorts? And he said, well, they would mix like this. There would be a tall and a short. There would be a tall and a short. There would be another tall and a short, and another tall and a short. So all of the kids would have a tall gene and a short gene. They would have a tall piece of DNA and a short piece of DNA. And so when they have this, what Mendel said is, well, look, if this parent with two tall genes and this parent with two little genes, if they got together, all of their little kid pea plants, they're going to be tall. And so Gregor Mendel realized that, but then he looked at something else. And he said, well, what about if one of the parents is tall, but is actually has one tall and one short? Then what happens? He said, well, there's going to be tall and short. So that's a tall pea plant. There's going to be tall and short, another tall pea plant, but look at this, two shorts and two more shorts. So Gregor Mendel said, hey, if this parent and this parent got together and they had little baby pea plants, it would mean that two of those baby pea plants are going to be tall and two of them are going to be short. And he went through this over and over and he learned so much about this. And we call it today Mendelian Genetics. And it's something that's so cool because it doesn't just apply to pea plants. It also applies to your eye color. It also applies to your hair color. Depending on what your hair color is and the hair color of your parents and the hair color of your grandparents, we could probably tell you what the hair color is going to be of your kids. Depending on what your eye color is and what the eye color of your parents and your grandparents are, we could give you a good idea about what your kid's eye color is going to be. All because Mendel, someone who loved Jesus so much and loved God's creation so much, would stare at pea plants and learn about them year after year after year. And now today, 200 years later, we get to write it up on a board, we get to watch it on a video, and we get to realize that God is at work even in the smallest things in DNA. And so what I want you to do is I want you to go out into the world. I want you to look at the trees around you and not just say, oh, it's a tree. I want you to look at its leaves. Look at the bark on the tree. I want you to look down at the grass at your feet and try to find the moss that's on the tree next to it. I want you to look for the rocks that maybe were blown out of a volcano, the rocks that were smashed so tight together to form them, the rocks that maybe were layered up. Look for the fossils that are in there that God has put there. Because all around us is evidence of what God is doing straight from His mind. It's exciting that we could see God in creation because He is the great creator. I hope you enjoy your week this week. I'm excited for next week when we get to talk about what God created next. We're going to talk about the animals and the things that move upon the earth and in the ocean. I know they weren't created on the same day, but we're going to get to take a look at them all together, days 4 and 5, and we're going to get to go somewhere and have some fun. I'm excited for next week. I hope you are too. Thanks, kids, for watching. I hope you enjoy looking at all of God's great creation.